Welcome, friends, to Sci-Fi Travelers. I'm here with a fantastic science fiction story. In this episode, I'll tell you the story of Lucas, a man who encounters the most beautiful and fiercest women on the planet. Buckle up and enjoy the story. Happy viewing. I rented a cheap room, but my roommates were the most beautiful and feisty alien women in the galaxy. The lease had been the kind of cheap that a sensible man would have treated like a fish left out in the sun. Pretty on the outside, deeply suspicious once you got close enough to smell it. Lucas was not, by his own frank admission, a sensible man. He was a broke one, which is a different thing entirely, and broke men have a talent for reading suspicious documents very quickly and signing them even faster, on the theory that whatever's wrong with the room will at least be a roof-shaped wrong. So he stepped off the transit ring onto Station Merresh with 2 duffel bags, a wallet you could have used as a whistle for all the good it did, and a printout of an address that the station's directory kept insisting was residential, sub-level, mixed occupancy. He had chosen to interpret mixed occupancy as has other people in it, which was technically true, the way a supernova is technically warm. The station itself was a great turning drum of salvaged hulls and honest rust, humming with the sort of ambient vibration that gets into your molars within the first hour and never fully leaves. Vendors sold noodles that glowed faintly. A maintenance drone the size of a terrier followed him for 3 corridors, judging him before losing interest. By the time Lucas found the door, battered, gray, stenciled with a unit number that someone had tried to scratch off and failed, he had rehearsed a friendly, humble, "I'll be no trouble" introduction roughly 40 times. The door slid open on the first word of it. He got as far as "Hi, I'm" before the apartment made its position clear. It was small, not cozy small. Not efficient small. Small the way a shoe is small when it is the wrong shoe. And it was, without any ambiguity whatsoever, already inhabited. 3 women turned to look at him with the unified, frozen stillness of a room that has just heard a very unwelcome noise. 3 alien women. He registered a half-second later because each of them wore a pair of long, elegant, swept-back ears that rose to graceful points well above the crown of their heads. The only thing he'd later realize that marked them as anything but human, and the sort of detail that made a man abruptly aware of how round and unremarkable his own ears were. "No," said the first one, before he'd finished being visible. She was leaning against the counter of a kitchenette that could generously be called a nook and less generously called a cupboard with ambitions, arms folded, a smirk already loading behind her eyes like a weapon on a slow charge. "Absolutely not. Ava, tell me you didn't." "I didn't," said the second, taller, sharper, holding a tablet that appeared to contain a chore roster of frankly military complexity. She looked at Lucas the way a customs officer looks at a bag that has just started ticking. "The landlord did. The empty room. He filled it." "He filled it with a human," said the first one, Camilla, pronouncing the word the way one might say, damp. Lucas raised one duffel bag an inch, a small, hopeful gesture, like a man showing a growling dog that his hands were empty. "In fairness, I come with my own bedding." Nobody laughed. He hadn't really expected them to, but a man likes to test the waters, and now he knew the water was cold. The third woman said nothing at all. She sat near the room's single porthole window, in the one pool of real light the apartment seemed to own, and where the other 2 crackled, she was simply still. Blue-skinned, not a painted blue, but a deep, even oceanic blue that caught the light along her cheekbones, with her long ears swept back and her hands folded loosely in her lap. She watched him, not with Camilla's amusement or Ava's suspicion, but with something quieter and considerably more unnerving. A level, measuring calm, the calm of someone deciding exactly which drawer to file him in and in no hurry to do it. When their eyes met, she didn't look away, and Lucas, who had built an entire personality around the strategic deployment of a disarming grin, found the grin arriving a half-second late and landing badly. "That's Stella," said Camilla, without warmth. "She's the quiet one. Don't get excited. She watches everyone like that. She once stared at a delivery crate for an hour because she didn't trust it." "The crate was leaking," Stella said. Her voice was low and unbothered. It was the only thing she said, and it settled the matter of the crate with such finality that Lucas privately resolved never to become a crate. Ava set down the tablet with the air of a woman tabling a motion she fully intended to lose on principle. "Here's how this works, human. That room," she jabbed a thumb toward a partition so thin it was really more of a suggestion than a room, "is yours, apparently. Because we are not, it turns out, allowed to remove a legal tenant just because we find him personally regrettable. Everything else in here is ours. The fridge is ours. The good chair is ours. The water pressure, such as it is spiritually ours. You are here on sufferance. Do you know that word?" "I'm getting a real vivid sense of it," Lucas admitted. Camilla pushed off the counter and drifted closer, ears tilting with lazy menace. "Rules. 1. Anything with a name on it, in the fridge, is a person's, and that person is not you. 2. The reclaimer clogs, and when it clogs, it becomes your problem, spiritually and also literally. 3. Stella said quietly from her pool of light, not looking up now. "Don't make yourself at home. Just make yourself useful." And that, Lucas thought, dragging his bags toward the partition that was going to have to learn to be a room, was the first thing any of them had said that sounded less like a threat and more like the truth. The apartment, Lucas discovered over his first week, was not so much a home as a small sovereign nation, and like most small sovereign nations, it ran on grievance, tradition, and a founding document nobody would show him. The founding document was the chore roster. Ava guarded it like a holy relic, updated it with the grim satisfaction of a bureaucrat who had finally been given real power, and referred to it in disputes with the phrase, "per the roster," which functioned in that household roughly the way because God said so functions elsewhere. Lucas learned the roster existed the way he learned most of the local laws, by breaking one and watching 3 sets of long ears swivel toward him in unison, like radar dishes locking onto an incoming threat. The threat, in that instance, was that he had used the wrong sponge. "That," said Camilla from the doorway, with the hush of a woman witnessing a crime, "is the reclaimer sponge." Lucas looked at the sponge. It looked, to his untrained human eye, exactly like a sponge. "It's blue." "Everything I own is blue," Stella said mildly, passing behind him toward the good chair. "And you don't scrub the counter with me." He nearly dropped the sponge. It was, he was fairly sure, the first joke any of them had aimed near him rather than at him, and it had come from the quiet one, delivered flat and dry and without so much as a glance to see if it had landed. It landed. He decided not to make a thing of it, because making a thing of it felt like the fastest way to ensure it never happened again, and instead just said, "Noted, the sponge and I will keep it professional," and went to find, per the roster, the correct and morally superior counter-sponge. He had settled early on a strategy, and the strategy was this: lose gracefully. He could not out-argue Camilla, whose wit came preloaded and never seemed to need reloading. He could not out-organize Ava, who had once won a 15-minute debate about dish-drying protocol using a diagram. And Stella he could not read at all. She simply watched, weighing him against some private scale whose units he didn't know, and no argument in the galaxy talks a scale into a different number, so Lucas stopped trying to win. He absorbed the jabs, agreed cheerfully to his own regrettable existence, took the worst shifts on the roster without complaint, and kept his head down with the patience of a man who has decided that the only way through a briar patch is to become, temporarily, extremely boring to briars. It was working, slowly, in the way water works on stone, which is to say invisibly, and then all at once. Camilla's needling took on a warmer edge, less get out and more. "Let's see what you do with this one." Ava caught herself, once, saying, "We're low on filters," instead of "You're low on filters," and looked briefly furious about it. And Stella watched. Always Stella watched. Then, on the 9th night, the air scrubber died. It didn't die quietly. Station-grade scrubbers rarely do. They go out the way a very old man leaves a party, with a great deal of wheezing, a final aggrieved rattle, and then a silence somehow louder than any noise it had made alive. Lucas woke at some grim hour to that silence and to the first faint, Swedish wrongness in the air, the smell of a sealed room beginning to notice it was sealed. By the time he'd pulled on his shirt and shuffled out, Ava was already standing over the dead unit with the tablet, and Camilla was pronouncing last rites. "It's finished," Camilla said. "It's had a good life. It has scrubbed its last air. We call the landlord in the morning, he ignores us for a week, and we all get very philosophical about breathing." "The landlord," Ava said, with the flat certainty of hard experience. "We'll send someone in 9 days. The someone will be a drone. The drone will look at it, decide it's out of scope, and leave." This, Lucas already knew, was almost certainly true. He'd met the maintenance drones, and their defining quality was a serene, unshakable conviction that whatever was broken was technically somebody else's department. So he didn't say anything hopeful. He just knelt down on the cold floor, popped the access panel with a thumbnail, and started taking the thing apart. He wasn't a mechanic, but he'd grown up patching machines older and meaner than this one, and station tech, for all its alien pedigree, still ran on the same tired ideas everywhere. Something spins, something filters, something clogs, and the clog is always, always, in the part designed to be hardest to reach. 20 patient minutes and 1 scorched knuckle later he found it. A fan bearing seized solid with the fine gray grime that Merresh breathed out like a habit. Worked it loose, cleaned it, coaxed it, seated it back, and closed the panel. The scrubber drew a long breath. The sweet wrongness thinned and vanished. The apartment, quietly, went back to being survivable. He said nothing about it. He didn't announce it, didn't wait for applause, didn't so much as glance around for a witness. He just wiped his hands, muttered something about the hour, and went back to his partition to reclaim what remained of the night. Camilla had already drifted off mid-eulogy. Ava had gone back to bed the moment the air moved. But Stella was still there, in the dark by the porthole, and she had watched the whole thing without a word. And what troubled her, she would sit with it a long while after his door had slid shut, was not that he'd fixed it. It was that he hadn't mentioned it. Anyone else would have. Anyone else would have wanted the ledger balanced, the debt noted, the credit filed. He'd fixed the air they all breathed and slipped off to bed like a man who didn't expect the world to owe him anything for it. And that, against all her careful measuring, was the first thing about the human she could not immediately file away. After the scrubber, the small kindnesses started, and they started the way Lucas did most things, without announcement, without ceremony, and with a stubborn refusal to be caught in the act. A door hinge that had shrieked like a scalded cat for a month simply stopped shrieking one morning, oiled by someone who left no note. The reclaimer, that great clogging beast at the heart of the apartment's plumbing and its politics, began to clog less, because someone had taken to descaling it on the sly before it reached the crisis point that would land it, per the roster, on his own head anyway. He'd worked out that it was easier to prevent the beast than to fight it, which is a life philosophy as much as a chore strategy, and one the others had never had the spare energy to adopt, because energy, on Merresh, was the thing nobody had. Lucas came to understand this slowly, in the gaps between shifts. The 3 of them worked the way migrant labor always works on a station like this. Too many hours across too many jobs. None of them the kind that noticed if you were exhausted. Camilla pulled doubles at a cargo transfer bay, came home smelling of ozone and machine grease, and covered the smell with jokes the way some people cover it with cologne. Ava ran freight manifests by day, and, it emerged, a second quiet job by night that she never named and no one asked about, which was itself a kind of station etiquette. You didn't ask what a person did at 3 in the morning to make rent, you just noticed the shadows under their eyes and let it lie. So one night when Ava's second job ran long, and her freight shift loomed at dawn with no gap between them, Lucas, who had that morning off, and who had been paying quiet attention to how the manifests worked, took the early shift under her name and told the supervisor, when asked, that Ava had swapped with him. It wasn't strictly allowed. It wasn't strictly disallowed either, in the way of station rules, which mostly existed to be leaned on until they gave. Ava came home to find her shift already gone, and a human asleep sitting up against the partition wall, still in his work vest, and she stood there for a long moment with an expression that had nowhere familiar to go. "You didn't have to do that," she said later, in the flat tone of a woman handing back something she wasn't sure she was allowed to keep. "I had the morning," Lucas said, which was true, and which explained nothing, which was the point, and there was the plate. This was the one that got under Stella's guard the most, though she'd have died before saying so. Whoever came home last, and on Merresh someone always came home last, dragging in from the docks past the hour when the corridors dimmed to save power, would find, under a cover on the counter, a plate. Not much. Reconstituted protein and station-grown greens, the same drab fare they all lived on. But warm, or as warm as the little heating pad under it could keep it, waiting for a person who'd worked too late for anyone to have waited up. No name on it. Names, Camilla had made abundantly clear that first day, meant ownership, and this plate belonged to whoever needed it. It just appeared. It kept appearing. And the apartment, which had spent its whole existence as a private kingdom of three, found itself quietly, grudgingly, becoming a place where somebody left food out for you in the dark. The thaw showed in small defections from the old hostility. Camilla still needled. She'd have needled a saint, but the jabs had turned inside out, become the kind you only aim at people you've decided to keep. "Look at him," she'd say, watching Lucas lose a card game he was clearly losing on purpose to keep the peace. "Our human. Domesticated. Practically house-trained. Our human." The word slipped in without anyone remarking on it, and everyone remarked on it privately. Ava added him to the roster proper, not as the regrettable extra tacked on at the bottom in smaller text, but as a full line, equal weight, equal blame. It was, from Ava, roughly equivalent to a knighthood. But it was the space between Lucas and Stella that changed the most, and it changed in the opposite direction from everything else, not louder, but quieter, where the others had thawed toward him in words, more jokes, more talk, more our human. Stella thawed toward him in silence. She stopped watching him like a leaking crate and started, he slowly realized, simply being wherever he was. When he descaled the reclaimer, she'd appear with a rag and work the other end, neither of them saying much beyond the mechanical. When he took the counter to eat his own drab plate at some odd hour, she'd already be there in her pool of porthole light, and he'd sit, and they'd share the small, comfortable quiet of two people who had independently discovered they didn't mind the other's company enough to ruin it with conversation. He knew almost nothing about her. He knew she was the quietest. He knew she'd once distrusted a crate and been right. He knew her blue caught the porthole light in a way he'd started, against his better judgment, to look forward to. He didn't know where she'd come from, or why none of them ever spoke of before, or what had built the wariness he could feel her setting down around him one careful inch at a time, like a person lowering something heavy she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it had weight. And through all of it, folded into the warmth of the thawing little home, sat a question none of them had thought to ask aloud, the one that had started the whole thing. Why was the rent so cheap? Why had a landlord who ignored their dying heir for 9 days at a stretch gone to the trouble of filling an empty room, of putting a human, of all things, into a place that had been happily, defiantly theirs? Lucas had stopped wondering about it, because he'd stopped feeling like an intrusion and started feeling like a resident, and residents don't interrogate their own good fortune. That was, it would turn out, exactly the mistake the landlord had counted on all of them making. The notice came stuck to the door with the particular adhesive that station bureaucracy reserved for news you would want to peel off and pretend you'd never received. It was Camilla who found it, coming off a double, and she read it twice on the assumption that she'd misread it once, and then she brought it inside and set it on the counter the way you'd set down something that might still be alive. "Residency reclassification," she announced in the voice of a woman reading her own weather forecast and not liking the front coming in. "Station-wide, sub-level occupancy under review, all units to be reassessed for compliance with the revised habitation code." She looked up. "Anybody know what any of that means?" It means, Ava said slowly, already reaching for her tablet, already pulling the manifests of officialdom she knew better than any of them. Somebody upstairs wants the sublevels emptier than they are, and when a station wants you gone, it doesn't throw you out. It reclassifies you out. Cleaner. No mess. No one to blame. Lucas, who had learned to be quiet when the citizens of the small nation discussed matters of state, watched Stella. She hadn't moved from the porthole, but her stillness had changed quality. Gone from the resting calm he'd grown used to into something drawn taut, a wire under load, and her long ears had lowered a fraction against her hair the way he'd only ever seen when the reclaimer failed at the worst possible hour. She was reading the notice from across the room without needing to hold it. She'd seen this shape before. It took Ava the better part of the night to untangle it, and when she did, she put the tablet down very carefully, as if it had grown heavy. "I understand the rent now," she said. "The rent?" said Camilla. "The cheap rent. The empty room he was so eager to fill." Ava looked at Lucas, and there was no hostility in it, which was almost worse. The revised code protects certain occupancies from reassessment, registered ones, grandfathered, and there's always a clause, that gives a unit protected status if it houses a registered human tenant. Something about interspecies habitation quotas, station charter, a treaty nobody's read in 40 years. She exhaled. "The three of us in this unit, we don't clear the new code. We'd have been reassessed, reassigned, split up more likely, or sent up the ring where the rent isn't cheap and isn't survivable. But a unit with a registered human in it does clear it." She let that sit. "He didn't rent us a roommate. He rented us a shield, and he did it without telling us, because the whole thing only works if the human's real, if he actually lives here, actually signed, actually believes he found himself a bargain." The silence that followed had a shape to it. Lucas felt it settle over him and understood with a slow, sinking clarity that he had spent 3 months being quietly, gratefully useful to people who had just learned they'd been quietly, unknowingly using him, and that the two facts were the same fact, and that pride is a strange animal that can be wounded worst by good news. "So we've been hiding behind him," Camilla said. Not a question. Her jokes had all left the room. "This whole time, behind the human we spent a week trying to freeze out. That's—" She laughed once with no humor in it at all. "That's the funniest thing that's ever happened to me, and I can't work out how to laugh at it." "You didn't know," Lucas said. "I didn't know. Nobody stood behind anybody, we just lived here." But he could hear how thin it sounded against the weight of it, and he could see that for Ava, who prided herself on knowing exactly how every system worked, the unbearable part wasn't the danger. It was that she'd missed it, that she'd been managed. It was Stella who moved, finally. She rose from the porthole and crossed the little room, and she stopped in front of Lucas, and for the first time since he'd stepped through that door, she wasn't measuring him. The wariness he'd felt her lower inch by inch over 3 months, he watched the last of it go, not because she'd decided to trust him, but because the thing she'd been guarding against had already happened, and there was no point guarding the door after the house was open. "I've been reclassified before," she said very quietly, and the others went still, because Stella did not talk about before, ever, and everyone in that room knew it. "On another station. I had a home. I had a place I'd made, a life I'd built out of nothing, and one day, a notice went up on a door, and a code changed, and none of it was mine anymore. No one threw me out. They just changed what the words meant until there was no word left for me to stay." Her ears had lowered fully now, and her blue was dark in the dimmed corridor light. "So I decided I wouldn't do that again. Want a place. Let it matter. Because when you let a place matter, they've got something to take." She looked at him, and there was something raw and unguarded in it that made his chest ache. "And then you fixed the air, and you left the plate out, and you didn't tell anyone. And I stopped being careful. I noticed I'd stopped. I was angry at myself about it for a month." A breath. "I don't want to be reclassified out of another home, Lucas. I've only just admitted this one was starting to be one." Nobody spoke. The apartment hummed its old molar-deep hum around them. And Lucas, who had built a whole self out of losing gracefully and never expecting to be owed, found there was nothing graceful he could say to that. And so he said the only true thing he had, which was, "Then we don't let them." And Stella looked at him a moment longer and said less, because less was all that was needed now. War, it turned out, was mostly paperwork. And the small sovereign nation went on to a war footing the way it did everything, loudly over the kitchenette, with strong opinions about whose turn it was to make the tea. The reclassification sweep had a date now, printed on a second, worse notice, an assessment hearing, 3 weeks out, at which each sub-level unit would present itself before a station adjudicator and be found compliant, or found gone. 3 weeks to turn a suspicious bargain into an airtight defense. Camilla, reading the hearing notice aloud, observed that they had less time to save their home than the landlord had once taken to fix a light, and everybody agreed this was true, and also, cosmically, unfair. They divided the labor the way the roster had trained them to. Camilla had contacts, as the whole sub-level did, a loose subterranean freemasonry of people who owed each other favors and traded them like currency because currency was the one thing none of them had, and she went spelunking through it, coming home each night with a new fragment of intelligence and a new story about the man who'd traded it. Ava took the code itself, all of it, the revised habitation charter and the 40-year-old treaty buried under it, and read it the way a general reads terrain, looking for the ground where a smaller force could hold. And Lucas, who had emerged, had the one skill none of them had ever needed before, a bureaucratic literacy born of a childhood spent watching machines and forms break in the same predictable ways, took the registration. His registration. The single thread the whole defense hung from. The clause protects a unit housing a registered human tenant, Ava said, tapping the relevant line so hard the tablet flinched. Which you are. Which is the problem. I feel like being registered is usually the good outcome, Lucas said. It's the good outcome if the registration holds up. He filed it fast and cheap, which means he filed it sloppy, which means the adjudicator can find a hole in it, void your tenancy, and reclassify the unit right out from under all of us. And he keeps his hands clean because, oh dear, the human's paperwork simply didn't hold. Nothing to be done. Ava's ears flattened. He didn't just use us. He built the shield out of paper he knew might tear. If it tears at the hearing, he loses nothing, and we lose everything. This was the moment, Lucas would think later, when the thing changed from their fight that he was helping with into his fight too, because the weak point in the whole edifice was him, and a man does not stand idly by while his own paperwork betrays the people who leave a warm plate out for him in the dark. So he took the registration apart the way he'd taken the scrubber apart, patiently on the floor, looking for the seized bearing in the part designed to be hardest to reach, and he found it. The landlord had registered him under a provisional occupancy code, the cheap, fast kind, the kind an adjudicator could dissolve with a signature. But buried in Ava's 40-year-old treaty was an older, sturdier status, permanent interspecies habitation, nearly impossible to grant and nearly impossible to revoke, that required, among other things, documented evidence of established, good-faith cohabitation over a sustained period. Evidence of established cohabitation, Lucas read aloud and looked up. Do we have 3 months of a human living here, being useful, sharing the chores, leaving food out, fixing the air? Camilla stared at him. Then she started, slowly, to grin, her old wicked grin, the first one to survive the arrival of the notice. We have, she said, a roster. Ava went very still, and then made a sound Lucas had never heard her make, which was a laugh of pure vindictive joy. 3 months of the roster. 3 months of Lucas logged per the roster on every clogged reclaimer and worst shift and desk scaling and dish rotation, in Ava's own meticulous hand, time-stamped, unfalsifiable, a bureaucratic monument to exactly the established good-faith cohabitation the older status required. The chore roster that had begun as a weapon aimed at the regrettable human had become, without anyone planning it, the single most complete piece of legal evidence in the sub-level. You built our defense, Camilla told Ava, delighted. Out of pettiness. Months ago. Preemptively. You are the most magnificent person I have ever been afraid of. Per the roster, Ava said with tremendous dignity. I always am. It got tense in the days that followed, and it got funny in the way things get funny when four exhausted people are pushing the same boulder up the same hill and can't stop, and it got close, closer than the little apartment had ever been. They rehearsed the hearing over cold tea. They ran the arguments until they could recite each other's parts. And in the small hours, when the others had finally gone down, Lucas would find Stella at the porthole, and she stopped merely sitting with him in silence and started, at last, handing him the map of how these systems break people, where the adjudicators looked, what they wanted to hear, the specific cruelty of a process designed to make you argue for your own right to a door. She knew it because she'd lost to it once. And on the last quiet night before the hearing, she said without looking at him, "The first time, I fought so they'd let me leave with dignity. I didn't fight to stay. I didn't think I was allowed to want to." She turned then, her blue dark and certain in the porthole light. "This time I want to stay, here, in this ridiculous, argumentative, impossible box, with—" And she stopped, because she had run out of the habit of saying more than was needed, and he had run out of needing her to. The hearing room was, disappointingly, just a room. The same battered gray as everything on Merresh, with a table, a station adjudicator who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, and a queue of sub-level tenants filing through to argue for their own doors. Camilla had wanted something grander to be terrified of. "I prepared to be intimidated," she muttered, "and instead it's a woman with a tablet and a headache. I resent it." The adjudicator was named Nora, according to the placard, and she processed the units ahead of theirs, with the mechanical mercy of someone who had said reassigned too many times to feel it anymore, and each reassigned landed in the waiting room like a dropped tool. Then it was their turn, and the landlord was there. He had come, of course. He'd come to watch his cheap paper tear, to collect the empty unit the code would hand him, to lose nothing while four people lost everything, and he arrived wearing the small, oiled smile of a man who has already won and is only present for the pleasure of the formality. He set down the provisional registration, his registration, the sloppy fast one, the seized bearing at the heart of the machine, and he began smoothly to express his deep regret that the human tendency might, on close inspection, prove insufficient to code. Ava let him finish. Ava, Lucas had learned, always let people finish, because she'd found nothing frightened a confident man like being permitted to complete his whole argument before she dismantled it. Then she laid the roster on the table. Not the provisional code. The old one. Permanent interspecies habitation, dredged up from the 40-year-old treaty nobody had read, and behind it 3 months of time-stamped, meticulous, unfalsifiable evidence of established good-faith cohabitation, logged in Ava's own hand, a human on every shift, every clog, every descaling, every dish rotation. A bureaucratic monument built out of pure spite by a woman who had never once imagined she was building a defense. Nora, the adjudicator, who had processed 40 units of misery that morning, read it again. And something flickered across her tired face that Lucas realized, with a small shock, was interest. "This unit qualifies for permanent status," Nora said, "which supersedes the provisional filing." She looked up at the landlord, and the interest sharpened into something colder. "And which I can only grant on a filing that predates the reclassification. This registration," a tap on his sloppy paper, "was filed the week the reclassification was announced, internally, before the public notice." A pause that stretched. "You knew the sweep was coming, and you filled an empty unit with a protected tenancy to shield your own rental income from a code you had advanced knowledge of. That's not a habitation quota. That's using the interspecies charter to defraud the reassessment." She was already typing. "The permanent status stands. The cohabitation is documented and genuine, whatever your intentions. Your provisional filing is void, and your advanced knowledge is now a matter for the charter board." She looked at him with the flat pleasure of a woman who had finally, after 40 units, gotten to say something she meant. You may go. The tenants stay. The loophole he'd built to house them, turned in his own hand, had become the thing that housed them for good, and turned in the other direction, had become the thing that undid him. Camilla made a sound that was not dignified. Ava permitted herself exactly one nod, and the landlord's small, oiled smile went somewhere private to die, and he left, and that was the last any of them ever had to think about him. They walked home through the humming sub-level corridors as legal, permanent, unreclassifiable residents of a converted storage nook and the cramped kingdom attached to it, and Camilla narrated the whole way, already turning it into the story she'd tell for years, the one where the human they'd tried to freeze out turned out to be the load-bearing wall of the entire household. Domesticated, she pronounced, delighted, unlocking the door. House-trained, and structurally essential. We can never get rid of him now, it's in the treaty. Which was, Lucas noted, the closest thing to welcome home he was ever going to get from Camilla, and he took it, because he'd learned to take the warmth in the shape it came. He had come off the transit ring 3 months ago, a broke man who'd built a whole self around expecting nothing and being owed nothing, losing gracefully because losing was what he knew. He'd fixed the air and left the plate out and told no one, because a man who expects the world to owe him nothing doesn't keep a ledger. And somewhere in the desk scaling and the covered shifts and the roster that made him a full line in someone else's hand, he'd stopped being the man who expected nothing and become, without quite noticing the moment it happened, someone with a place, someone with people who left food out for him in the dark now. No name on the plate, because names meant ownership and this belonged to whoever needed it. And lately, sometimes, that was him. That night, the apartment did its old molar deep hum, and Camilla slept the sleep of the vindicated, and Ava filed the permanent status 4 separate places out of principle. And Lucas found Stella at the porthole, in the one pool of real light the place had ever owned, her blue catching it the way he'd long since stopped pretending he didn't look forward to. She didn't watch him like a leaking crate anymore. She'd stopped being careful a long time ago and stopped being angry about it more recently. And now she just made room for him on the narrow sill without a word. "I wanted to stay," she said quietly. "Here. With." And she stopped again, the way she always stopped, having run out of the habit of saying more than was needed. "I know," Lucas said. "You don't have to finish it." "I wasn't going to," she said, and closed the small distance they'd been circling for 3 months instead, which said all of it and needed no words at all. 2 people who had long ago run out of reasons to keep saying nothing, in a cramped, argumentative, impossible little home that was, at last and for good, theirs. Outside, the station turned. Inside, the lights went low, the door stayed locked, and the plate on the counter, warm under its cover, waited for whoever came home last. Lucas came to Station Merresh chasing nothing grander than a cheap room, and what he found was this: that a home is rarely the thing you sign for. It's the air someone fixes without telling you. It's the shift quietly covered, the hinge that stops shrieking, the plate left warm under a cover with no name on it. Because the things that belong to a home belong to whoever needs them. He arrived a man who had trained himself to want nothing, to expect nothing, to lose gracefully, because losing was familiar and hoping was not. And somewhere between the sponge he used wrong and the door he never wanted to leave, he learned the most frightening lesson of all, that letting a place matter is the same thing as giving the world something it can take from you, and that the people worth staying for are the ones who make you willing to risk it anyway. So let me leave you with the question the story left with me. What in your life have you been careful not to want, because wanting it would mean you could lose it? Which door have you kept yourself from calling home, just in case the words changed and there was no place left for you to stay? Stella spent years fighting only for the dignity to leave. It took a broke stranger and a warm plate in the dark to teach her she was allowed, at last, to fight to stay. You're allowed, too. The plate is still warm. Someone is still waiting up. The only question is whether you'll let yourself walk through the door and finally, quietly, call it home. Another great story comes to an end here, friends. I hope you enjoyed the story, so please hit the like button, Leave your thoughts about the story in the comments below, and subscribe to Sci-Fi Travelers so you don't miss the next story. See you in the next one.